Welcome to Living from the Heart. I am your host, Tina Thrussell, co-founder of Best You Can Be and messenger of the Shin Dao, the Way of the Heart. I am delighted to have my guest, Adele Fedorak, on the show today. I was only introduced to Adele just a few short weeks ago through a mutual friend, Laurie Seymour. And after just a few minutes of talking to Adele, it was very clear to me that she is passionate about helping people. And I love the way she does that through storytelling. I was quite enthralled with what she had to tell me about the work that she does, and I couldn't wait to have her on the show. So we had a little bit of technical difficulty this morning. We're late starting, but we're here, and that is what matters. And we thank you for bearing with us and for tuning in. And just before I bring Adele onto the show, I would like to invite you to draw your attention to the crawler at the bottom of the screen that gives you a website, bestyoucanbe.ca, where you can subscribe to receive a complimentary e-zine called Heart and Mind Matters. Good morning, Carmen. We just had somebody join us live. This e-zine contains an inspirational article, a YouTube video, quote of the week, and it's a great read, or so our readers of more than 13 years have told me. Now, without further ado and blabber, I would like to bring Adele Fedorak onto the screen. Here we come. There you are. Hello.
Hello. Hi, Tina. Nice to be with you.
Thank you. Thanks for bearing with those technical issues and agreeing to be here on the show with me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for your patience on my end with my technical difficulties.
No worries. No worries. So I was intrigued with the fact that your speech language, or am I saying that backwards? Speech pathologist? Speech language pathologist?
Speech language pathologist.
Okay,
Yeah.
speech language therapist, and
I work with people like you.
Not normally that tongue-tied, but and so with this interesting background of, yes, helping people speak clearly, you also add this aspect of storytelling and finding power through your story to help you speak. So I'd just love to hear more about that for our viewers. Oh, Lana, good morning. She says, we're looking gorgeous.
You have good people.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
Yeah. So my work with stories started with children, and with there's something in language development for children that's narrative development. And just like we develop grammar, we could also develop story grammar. So there's actually a way of looking at children's language as they tell a story and overtly teaching them story grammar. And simply working within story, within language with children has given me some insight into the value of story. And it's such a small window, and it's such a huge impact. So children who I work with story, when they can tell a better story, they connect with people. It's really basic. When you can tell about something that happened, you can connect with people better. And when you're better at it, your speech is actually clearer, your ideas are clearer, and for a child that can be very, very it can be life-changing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so you've taken that work, you said it started with children. So have you expanded that? You've taken that into the adult world now.
Yeah. Yeah. My work as a coach, I found story to be a very useful tool. And then I'm now studying with a man named Dr. David Drake, who actually he is the founder of narrative coaching. So it's actually a way of being and coach somebody through using story as a strategy, as a whole way of seeing the world, actually. And it's actually really fascinating, because one of the things I've actually struggled with is to take this story grammar. And you'll remember from school, and you tell stories all the time, that there's this the setting, then there's an initiating event where something happens and a response of the character. And there's that typical way of looking at story. And what's shown up to be very effective and very different in the storytelling work with adults is looking at story from a perspective of moments. Like a moment, in rather than trying to like grab a story, looking at it from describe a moment and work with story from there. And I found that very useful because until recently, I've identified as a lousy storyteller. And that's why this work has been like very interesting work for me, because it's still, even talking with you today, I am not what someone would think of when they think of a storyteller. And so, but what I found a number of ways, a ton of ways to make story accessible, but thinking of a moment. So do you feel like you're put on the spot when someone asks you to tell you a story, Tina?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Like, yeah, tell me a story. Well, no, but tell me about something that happened to you specifically or whatever, right? It's such a shift. Yeah. Tell me a story. It does feel like, now I've got to think of something that has all those elements of a story that we talked about.
And I better be entertaining, because they're looking for a story and they want to be entertained.
Yeah.
You get that piece too? Yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, are you from a long line of storytellers in your family?
I've never thought of that, but I think, gosh, when I think about my uncle, he was always telling stories, always. My parents, not so much, but I think extended family a little bit more. I loved being on stage when I was younger. It's interesting that you asked that. I remember I was in grade school still, elementary, and we had a school concert where the students could do whatever. And I chose to select an Indigenous story and tell that story as what I was going to do on stage. And I love the impact of what the messages that stories can deliver.
Yeah, and it's actually fascinating. That is one area is kind of in my look at next, is Indigenous storytelling, because there's such a wealth of knowledge and wisdom in that world, and it's a little bit different than telling personal stories.
Yes, definitely. So you said I'm referring to yourself. I'm not what people would typically think of as a storyteller. So how do you think people typically see a storyteller? What do people expect?
I guess that goes through my own story of what a storyteller is, and that's that entertaining life of the party, has you laughing and with effortlessly. That's the other piece in there, effortlessly. And and yet we all tell stories. Like, event knowledge is story. So when we talk, over 50%, like something around 65% of what we say to each other is event knowledge. So we are communicating in story all the time. But like when my kids are 13 and 14 now, but when they were little, they'd ask me to tell them a story, and I actually found that really hard. And that was actually the start of like, oh, I should be better at this. I'm a speech pathologist. I do this with kids. How come my kids don't find my stories entertaining? And I have lots of strategies around that now. Yeah.
So what's a strategy? Well, first of all, do you even go there? Do you go with strategies to help people be better storytellers, or why do you use storytelling in coaching now? What's the purpose of it? How does it work?
Well, in coaching, I feel that, and I've noticed that when people understand their own stories better, their own big story, but also their own little stories, they know themselves better. They're more confident. there's such a richness in going back into story that we think we knew. Like this thing of having myself identified as a lousy storyteller, in my mind, I'm like, well, what kind of story can I use to demonstrate that? So I had to go back. Okay, what's the earliest moment that I remember self-identifying as a lousy storyteller? And then it took me back to, so it's 1972. I'm 5 years old. Do the math. Excuse me. I'm 5 years old. My socks are wet. I'm sitting at the dinner table with my family. It's cold outside and dark. And we're at a round wooden table, the kind that the leaves fall down on.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sharing a leaf with my sister Nadine. And our older sister Darcy is across the way at the other wooden leaf. And then my mom and dad are sitting there. And we're eating tuna casserole. And I love tuna casserole. And my sisters hate it. So it's awesome. And we're sitting around and we're talking. And well, they're talking. My sisters are talking a mile a minute. And my parents are talking. And I'm just sitting there. And if you looked at me, you would think I had nothing to say, but I had a lot to say. I just couldn't find that place to get in. I couldn't find that pause in what they were saying to get into it. So I sat there, and finally my dad goes, okay, everyone be quiet. Delzy hasn't said anything. Okay, Delzy, it's your turn to talk. And I couldn't say anything. I had nothing to say. And it was fascinating for me to go back to that place and find what was there. And not only did I find a 5-year-old who didn't have a voice, and then like, oh my gosh, that's some of my kids that I work with, but I found that I saw my dad in a whole nother way of holding space for me, seeing me. And I saw the dynamic and the energy of my sisters from this place of an adult looking at it rather than just remembering what a child looked at it and saw. And yeah, there was richness in that moment that if I hadn't have taken the time to go back into that story, I would have not had.
So were you able to identify by going back into that moment, what was it that stopped you up, that made you not able to speak? Were you able to discover that by going into that moment?
Well, it's interesting. Now that you asked me a good question about it, I'm like, I need pause time. And I still need it as an adult, like socially. And then I go to my partner's family events. They talk a mile a minute. They talk on each other's words. And to me, that's like so, it struck me interestingly as so rude, like get off my words. But that's just how they interact. And I need lots of pause time. So that's why you and I connected really well. There's a moment where you just give the pause and in our conversation, and you saw me light up when I started to talk about story.
Yeah.
Some of us just need more.
So I'm going to make this more obvious to those who are watching. This is a really important point, that we don't all communicate the same way. Some people can just blah, 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 nonstop and keep going. And then there's another layer of people who are doing the talking and they're not hearing what anybody else is saying anyway. So they're just talking for the sake of talking. There are those who can really talk fast, but still hear what's going on around them and pick up on it and add more to the conversation. And then there are those who just can't get into that space. And like you said, need that pause, need the time to digest, need time to formulate the words before they're spoken. And for those of us who are fast talkers who have no problem, if we can offer the graciousness of giving people time for that pause, then they are going to feel seen and heard, even if they're not speaking. And that is really, really important. And it's important for people who are in that space to understand that about themselves and be willing to speak up for themselves. Do you get to that point in your coaching?
Absolutely. And that's where the storytelling comes in. Because when you have, there's lots of us, we all have these pieces that we can't seem to get out, or can't seem to, when we do, they don't land and people don't really get it.
Mm.
So that's where those places are of working on a story and harvesting what those stories are, and then crafting those stories into a way that people actually want to hear it. Because our brains want to hear story. We're thirsty for it.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, it's true. It's kind of a fundamental thing, right? If you go back in history, as far as we have history, storytelling formed the basis of education, of sharing our history, of teaching, of entertaining. Story is a fundamental part of communication. It's what makes us interested in each other.
Mm-hmm. And you could even say that we had story before we had oral language, because there's event knowledge that's been captured in pictographs, and
Mhm.
event knowledge that's been pantomimed out, so that, because humans could hunt large game
Mhm.
before there was evidence of the vocal tract formation, how it is for speech. And so there's archaeological evidence that we were able to communicate event knowledge before we were able to speak.
Oh, wow.
Isn't
Yeah.
that fascinating?
It is fascinating. I never thought about it, but you're right. That all those pictures on caves and things like that, yeah, that was storytelling before they could probably tell those stories,
Mm-hmm.
which is why they put them on the wall.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I never really thought about
Yeah,
that.
it's fascinating. And we will fill in information when we have a partial story so that it can kind of make sense to us.
Yes.
Yeah. And we have control over that. Like, you might see your neighbors and it looks like they're talking to each other and then looking over at you, and you may think, oh my gosh, my neighbors are talking about me. Well, okay, that's one story. And it just could be that they're talking about something totally unrelated to you and they just happen to look at you. And that's another story. Like, once we're aware we're in story, then we have way more accessible to us in our choices.
Oh, yeah. Now we're getting into the big stuff, right? Perspectives.
Yeah.
That's what perspective is choosing a different story. Because that's all we do is tell stories in our mind constantly. And that was a great example. And in any moment, I can choose to pick an alternate ending for that story, or an alternate middle, even an alternate beginning. Any part that I'm filling in the blanks on, it's a guess. I'm taking
Yeah.
a stab in the dark. And yet we get so convinced that that's the truth just because it came to us. Why? I don't I don't
Mm-hmm.
understand that aspect of human nature, that we're so sure that what we filled in the blank with is a truth.
Yeah.
I,
And we're often filling in the blanks with those things that protect us and that try to keep us safe, that get us worried that we're maybe not safe, that we maybe don't belong, maybe we're not loved. Like, our brain is wired to do that because it keeps us safe. We have to always be watching that we belong, that we're loved, because we're humans and we survive with each other. So we better belong or we're going to die. That's wiring's in there still.
yeah,
So
yeah,
that's our default.
that's a good point. That's a good point. So I guess instead of being uptight about it and fighting it, we just learn to roll with it.
Yeah. And then choose and be in choice, right? Just like you said, it's like, I can choose to be different. I can choose to have a different perspective. And perspective is so fun to play with clients. Like, um, there's yeah, I can have my perspective, my spouse's, my children's. But then you can go really, really, yeah, fun. What would my dog say if my dog could talk?
Yeah.
Yeah. What would my glasses say? What would my journal say? What would the future say if the future could talk to me?
That is pretty expanding when you start to think about anything. If anything had a story, what would it say? It
Mm-hmm.
really, it's expanding.
Mm-hmm.
It gives us more options on how to look at things.
Mm-hmm.
And Lana's just made a comment here, but what a great point this is, that you change the story perspective and you change everything.
Everything. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. As
Yeah.
as a personal development leader for many years before I moved more into the spiritual guidance realm, what we talked about all the time is the stories that we're telling in our head are what's creating our reality. And in the spiritual realm, son of a gun, we come right back to that again.
Yes.
And what you're saying here is through conscious use of storytelling, we can be more conscious of our choices and the perspectives and what we're creating.
Yeah. And I love that you bring in the word conscious, because there's so many stories that run unconscious in us. Like there's our own story about ourselves, like I'm a lousy storyteller. Then there's the story that we have, like the we story, the bigger picture, like our family, our work environment that we're in. And then there's that larger underlying narrative of like the culture that we're in, those big pieces that we don't even recognize, or and the goal being to recognize it more of what we're in, with those pieces that have been so invisible for so many years now, in terms of gender, and there's so many pieces coming forward.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, who are the types of people that you typically work with when you're utilizing this storytelling aspect of your work?
Mm. Mm. I've worked in different realms. So when I work with parents of children, special needs are not, or no unique needs. Um, yeah, I work with I work with parents, not only telling stories to their kids, but how to frame their own life in the story that they're in as a parent. So I work with parents.
Mm.
Um, I work with. I recently just finished running a course for an organization to harvest and use their leadership stories within their organization. So I've worked with small business. I'm currently working with a small group of people on my first run of a oral storytelling. We're calling it the workshops, but it's to build a community. There's 6 people in it, and we're looking at, as a group, helping each other harvest stories, or stories, and craft stories to tell. So that small group, and I work one-on-one with uh, with people who just want to know their own story better and want to be able to articulate the information they have, their ideas, their thoughts, their beliefs, in a way that other people can hear them.
Mm. What comes to mind to me immediately is how important it is for entrepreneurs, people who are wanting to basically sell themselves. Any
Mm-hmm.
entrepreneur who says they don't like to sell, and so that's what you're doing. You're selling yourself.
Yeah.
You are providing a service or a product to people, but they want to buy it from you. You're not some big corporation. You're not a big company with a brand name. They're buying it from you. So if you don't know who you are and what your story is about why you're doing what you're doing, it's hard to be compelling.
And it's easy, if you don't have that story, to get sidetracked by the bright, shiny things that kind of come along. Too,
Yeah.
as an entrepreneur, is that because entrepreneurs tend to be so very creative, very interested in a variety of things. When you know your own story well, and you can keep coming back to your own story, it makes those decisions that are ahead of you um, easier.
Mm. it's kind of an interesting alignment with my husband Neal and I are both passion test facilitators. And we tell people, you know, when you align with your passions, then the universe conspires to assist you. And you're saying the same thing. When you're aligned with your story, then things fall in place, and you know what action steps to take, and there's support that comes your way, all of those things, because it is an alignment.
Mm. And you are working with story when you do that. I have no doubt that that is part of it. If nothing else, you're creating story with them in the work that you do.
Mm.
It is the story.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. The whole concept of story. Most people just think of it as that bedtime story that we read to children. And, you know, you pick the book off the shelf and read the story. And if you're really creative, you can just make up a story to tell them. But story goes so much deeper. That's just one little aspect of story.
It is. It is.
I was privileged to be able to do a stand-up comedy routine. There was a fundraiser where we had this boot camp, and it was all about
So
creating
good.
lots of little mini stories, right? That's really all that stand-up is. It's little, and it's like you said, it's capturing the moments. So there's this moment, this moment, this moment, and that is what a stand-up comedy routine is a collection of little moments, the little stories around little moments. It was so fun.
I bet.
And so scary, right? It was one of the scariest things I'd ever done, because at that point, I, like you, believed I was a lousy storyteller. And, you know, what was I thinking that I could entertain people with my stories? I remember the first night of the boot camp where we did our training, I went home bawling my eyes out. Like, this, I can't do this. This is not, who am I to think I'm, you know, it was really interesting.
Yeah.
And then when I could see the stories I was telling about how I couldn't tell stories, that helped to open up the door. Oh, stop.
Yeah. And you had even another element of what I see as pressure on that is that then you needed to be funny.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
And and the difference, because there are stories in there, the personal stories that we connect with each other with really well are the ones that show change, that show that vulnerability in something that's changed, something that's different. It doesn't have to be huge, but something that's different because that moment happened.
Those moments are the ones that speak to our hearts. Right?
And now you're talking, because that's, as entrepreneurs, that's what we want, is we want to connect to people's hearts. I mean, you do this all the time. You want to really connect, so you see them, they see you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's what the Shin Dao is. Shin means heart, and Dao is the way. Living the way of the heart is living from the heart, living by connecting with your own heart and connecting to the heart of others. And the only way we can do that is to listen to one another, to have kindness, to have compassion, to be in that space of love. And if we can do all of that within our storytelling, then it's magic. Yeah. Because it's real, it's authentic. It's not just the stories in our head, but it's the stories that come forward from how we feel. And I'm sure you must touch on that in your work as well.
Absolutely. And the piece about putting voice to the stories that are in our head. So there are helpful stories in our head, and there's helpful pieces. But as you talk, it reminds me how important it is to have that opportunity to put voice to what we need to say.
Interesting, Carrie just posted, business is not based on hearts. And I think it should be. And there's a movement towards that, right? There are a lot of, I can't say a lot. there are more and more companies that are focused on heart-based business. And I know myself personally, and Carmen, who's one of our viewers, we're involved in Emergent Workforce, which is about changing the workforce to a heart-based place so that people are heard and they feel that they can do the work that's making a contribution and all of these things. So there is a shift. And when we can shift the world of business, well, now we're cooking. Now society changes.
Yeah. And it depends what kind of business you're in. Right? Like there's a range of business. And the work I just did with the organization I worked with, part of our work was reconnecting to the purpose of why they show up every day for the work they do. Because sometimes the daily grind just grinds that out of you.
Yeah.
And it was valuable to show up for them to reawaken their heart, reawaken their purpose for why they're there. Because it's not just a job. They're there and
Yeah. That makes all the difference in the world. We look at the stats, and more than 75% of North Americans hate their jobs. What? That's where they spend most of their lives, right? Mm-hmm. Most of your working hours are at your job. So if you hate it and you can't find a sense of fulfillment and meaning and a sense of purpose in doing what you're doing, that's a pretty empty life. Mm-hmm. So if we can change the story that we tell about what we're doing, where we are, then we have a hope. And I'm sure that's where your leadership work makes such a difference, because if it can come a top-down understanding that everyone has value, everyone has something to contribute, and that leadership comes into that place of understanding the value of telling good stories, not those limiting stories, then they can encourage and foster a more friendly environment for people to be working in.
Yeah, and the leadership has a role in helping their people know the story of why they're working there. They also have a role in stopping the stories that are not helpful, getting in front of those stories that can bring down an organization. They have a responsibility to craft a story that people can grow into and live into in their organization. Yeah, it's a big part of being a leader, and the best leaders can do it. Oh my gosh, there's people I could listen to Barack Obama's story for a long time.
Yeah, that was an example of a leader with heart for sure. Yeah.
And then you can see how story can be destructive. A good story can be very destructive.
My goodness, I just suddenly realized we've already gone over half an hour. Wow, how did that happen? I want to put your website up here on the screen so that if people are intrigued by the work that you're doing or feel they're not a good storyteller and would like to be better and become part of the oral storytelling, I'm making sure I've got the spelling right here. TheStoryEdge.ca. There you go. This is where you can find Adele Fedorak. And I assume you're posting the potential future dates for your oral workshops, or yes?
Okay. Yes, I will. I haven't posted them yet, but this has to run again. It's been a very cool experience already.
Nice. Very nice. Well, to honor your time and our viewers' time, and I try to keep the show to a half an hour. So this has been fun. It's been interesting. I hope it's been mind expanding for those who have been watching or will watch the recording later. It will be posted on YouTube. So thank you, Adele, for sharing your time with us.
Thank you very much. This was This was lots of fun. I want to hear your stand-up routine maybe another time.
Well, it's on YouTube too, because my blessed husband did a Facebook Live while I was on stage. So it's there. Maybe it's time to post it again now that we're talking about it. Anyway, that was fun. I invite everyone to come back and watch the show again next week. Oh my goodness, who do I have? I just talked to someone. Oh yes, Valerie Shepherd is on next week.
Oh, she's lovely.
Yeah, another EBC member, amazing woman doing some heart-based work as well. So excited to have her on the show with us next week. So until then, create for yourself a love-filled day. Ciao for now.